We may not get through all of this material today, but that's okay. The way this is set up, we can extend it over if we do not. We're getting closer to our rhetorical reference point of West Peachtree and Fifth, and today we will see directly where that, in fact, comes from. I want to recap by pointing out that the Spanish and French colonial enterprise in the New World is very different than the English colonial enterprise, primarily because the Spanish and later the French is essentially a crown enterprise, meaning the government is involved, whereas the English colonies that developed from New England to where we are now, Georgia, developed primarily, they're very different from each other, but also independently, not only from themselves, but from the actual colonial power in most cases. In New England, these are the three sort of cultural hearths along the Atlantic coast of the English colonies going back to the 17th, 18th centuries. New England was settled by really religious zealots who didn't want to have anything to do not only with the mother country, they wanted to have nothing to do with anybody else. They wanted to sort of be, as they said, as a city upon a hill, meaning to show the rest of the world how to live according to a righteous life. These formed covenanted communities. They agreed in a kind of contract form where everybody had to sort of agree on all the actions that were to occur. The Mid-Atlantic, which is really Philadelphia, really Pennsylvania, is much more high-minded. By that I mean it was founded by an intellectual for the purpose actually of trying to create a society where everyone was equal. The problem is that the creator, William Penn, was a Quaker, and in Quaker beliefs, no person can sit in judgment of another person. That makes it a nice sort of way to live your life, but it's very difficult to run something that way. I mean, Georgia Tech needs a president, it needs a provost, it needs deans and school chairs. And without a sort of hierarchy of decision making, you've got a lot of problems. And those problems, as they developed in Philadelphia, would actually lead to the formation of the first municipal corporation in what is now the United States. That is an autonomous city government that could take care of the sort of collective political structure that could take care of fundamental things like fighting fires and chasing bad guys and doing those kinds of things that governments need to do. The Atlantic South was a very different enterprise altogether, typically settled by wealthy individuals from England who established a true colonial enterprise. What do I mean by a true colonial enterprise? You go somewhere and you extract a crop or a product or a thing, a mineral that you need to manufacture goods. You manufacture those goods and then you sell them back to the people who were providing the crop. That was the theory behind most of the Atlantic South, and as we'll see in the case of Georgia, they actually thought that they could grow silk, despite the fact that none of the people involved had ever set foot in the New World. Amazing. They thought they could grow silk because they were roughly at the same latitude as the silk growing region of China. So Savannah really begins as this kind of utopian silk colony, and in 8 years they produced enough silk to make one dress. That was it. All right. So these are very different, and the South is more complex because it's really divided into two parts. A coastal part, which we would call tidewater, a coastal plain, and then an upland part that we're in now, which is called the Piedmont, and further north, the mountains. These are very different culturally, very different in terms of the people who settled in them and so on and so forth. The South in general is noted for, in the colonial period, for an absence of towns. There really weren't very many cities. There were port cities. Savannah comes very late. Charleston is probably the biggest. There are inland ports like Augusta, Columbia, South Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, so forth, but in general, not very many cities at all in the South. This division between the Piedmont and the coastal plain between Tidewater and Piedmont is this line where crystalline rock meets sediment. So New England is organized in this community with collectively owned land called townships, in which everyone got a town lot. It's hard to call these towns. They're really sort of agricultural settlements that were based upon these sort of what Morris refers to as organic growth towns in England. But it's important, I think, in understanding cities in the United States, because I believe, as we'll see, that the American planned garden suburb of the 19th century is based on an idealized form of these townships. This is Sudbury, Massachusetts, that we look at here. So everyone lived in the town and worked common fields, so on and so forth, outside the town. The Mid-Atlantic, Philadelphia, we will concentrate on now. And you can tell immediately that this is a planned as a unit, planned as a whole. William Penn, when he conceives of this, is living at Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. He witnesses the fire of 1666. He wants to create what he calls a green country town. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. If you've ever been to a Phillies game or an Eagles game in Philadelphia, you would have a hard time imagining that brotherly love was anything Philadelphia ever aspired to. They even booed Santa Claus one time. That's true. They threw snowballs at Santa Claus, okay? I mean, that's pretty rough, right? So the thing about Philadelphia is it's between two rivers, the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River. And as we see, unlike New England, actually in all these cases, the ideal, what the founders had in mind and what they wanted, never developed. Something else developed, and it developed in a way that is fascinating because I think, as Sam Bass Warner has said, if you want to understand the American city in the 19th and early 20th centuries, you have to understand Philadelphia, because West Peachtree and Fifth comes from here. This is the origin of the concept of streets named after trees and indexed. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The streets that ran between the two rivers, the Schuylkill and the Delaware, are named after trees, like locust, cherry, juniper, peach tree, myrtle, etc. And the streets that run parallel to the river, starting at about 30th Street, going down here to 1st Street. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This was intentional on Penn's part, and it was integral to his plan to create this, quote, city of brotherly love, because he wanted to destroy traditional forms of social hierarchy. In other words, what we might call the eunomic, to use a Greek term, eunomic order, which is an order that's based upon status or merit, status in the community. It could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. And certainly coming on the heels of kings and monarchs and so forth, he wanted to create a sort of level playing field. And so the idea is that, you know, if you lived at Tottenham Court Road in London, it would mean that you probably had some proximity to or association with the crown or with nobility. Whereas if you live at 34 Fifth Street, that's no different than 34 Sixth Street. You know, the dictionary is just A, B, C, D, E, the first letter. It doesn't say that C is better than P or something like that. And so There was an attempt to create what I would call an isonomic order, which is simply an indexical system that allows you, like polar coordinates, allows you to locate in space for property transfers, for the delivery of mail, to have an address in the world, but there's no hierarchy in relation to any traditional form of authority, right? If I lived in Edinburgh at Bishopsgate or something, then I would probably be associated with the church, right? So here it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then these streets that are named, except for the two main ones, this being Broad Street and this being originally King Street, but quickly changed to Market Street, which is another characteristic of North American cities in the United States in the 19th century, all of which bear some parts of them, or in some cases all of them, actually are taking the Philadelphia plan as a kind of precedent. We even see Savannah, where after the middle of the 19th century, they start numbering streets and so forth, again, in imitation of Philadelphia. Now, these things come and go out of fashion. I do not believe that we have built a street that had numbers anywhere in the United States, at least since World War II, which is a long time, 60, 70 years. But for 120 years or more, we built lots of these streets because it was seen as being a sort of this indexical system as being a good thing. The other characteristic of this is that peculiarly in the United States, you have streets that are simply named after function, like Main Street. I mean, not very imaginative, not very poetic. Broad Street, it's just descriptive, all right? So let's talk about this for a moment here in terms of the conceptual differences of streets. It's very important. Street comes from a Latin word, strata, like the Italian strata, right? Which comes from what? A material condition, being paved. So in the medieval world, in Europe, the old Romans, say Roman Britain, the highway, the via, the way, becomes the high street when it moves from outside the gate of the city into the city. You follow me? So strata, street, comes from what? I just said it. The material, the actual constructional material. Road actually comes from rut, the same etymological root as rut, meaning it's, tracks in the mud somewhere, a rut. A rad, a wheel rad, it's a Norse word that comes into English through the Viking world. Then we have streets like Tottenham Court Road that, Marietta Street. What is the significance of Marietta Street? It takes me to Marietta. Okay? Right? Tottenham Court Road, which would be associated with nobility. What about Fifth Street? What does that indicate? In and of itself, nothing. It's just part of a larger indexical system which is intended to create this kind of level playing field that destroys traditional hierarchies based upon status in the community. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Yes. No, not always. In fact, it gets really confusing. Gainesville, Florida. Anybody here from Gainesville? No? University of Florida? Gainesville did follow certain precedents here, but they divided into northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast. And so there's a southeast 3rd Street and a southwest 3rd Street and a northwest 3rd Street. And if you don't know that up front, if you don't have prior knowledge, you will spend the better part of an afternoon looking for an address on 3rd Street, but you're in the wrong quarter of the city. Okay? So there was no particular pattern east to west or west to east, in the case of Gainesville, my guess is they would start in the center, quarter it, and then name everything. So 3rd Street continues, but it's southwest 3rd Street and southeast 3rd Street or if you go to 99 3rd Street, you don't know whether you're in the southeast or the southwest quarter up front, then you're in a lot of trouble, right? So you would always have, in Gainesville, you would always have to know what quarter of the city you were in, okay? Okay. Ordinary language often tells us a lot about things, I believe, the way we use ordinary language. For example, if you were giving someone directions to Georgia Tech from the airport, you would say, well, you get on the freeway north, and then you get off at 10th Street, let's say, okay? But if you're going to meet somebody for lunch at the Barrel House over here, you would say, or at the Georgia Tech Hotel, you would say what? It is at the intersection of 5th and Spring. Now, what's the difference there? You get off, right? As opposed to at. So at implies a coordinate, like latitude and longitude, right? Off means what? It's like a conveyor belt, and you get off of it. So one might think then that from how we just colloquially use ordinary language in these descriptions, that freeways are in fact not a street in this sense. They are something else, like a mechanical system, like an HVAC diagram or something, right? Okay. So it shares certain affinities with its French and Spanish counterparts because they're reading the same books. And what were these books? They were treatises on the ideal city that came out of the Italian Renaissance, the late Renaissance, the Counter-Reformation period around the time of Sixtus V and later. Among them were Scamozzi, an architect who wrote a treatise on the ideal city, in which he sort of, reading Vitruvius, he tried to imagine then what the ideal city would look like, and it would look something like this. These sort of round. We had a lot of round cities, and if you read Vitruvius, you sort of you would come to a similar conclusion. But as I said earlier, Vitruvius really was not clued in to Roman town founding at all. He shows no knowledge of it whatsoever. In fact, what he does display sort of indicates that he was sort of an outsider, a man of a lot of practical, as Alberti said, a man of a lot of practical experience, but he was not clued in. Some of these actually got built. This one was a colony of the city of Venice, Italy, in the Veneto. This is Palma Nuova. It was designed by Scamozzi, but not completed in its final form that we see here until the 19th century when Napoleon actually completed it. One of the things I'll just mention again about a round town, we see this in the case of Baghdad, no trace of it remains because a round town is a very difficult thing. It's a difficult form, round buildings, round anything. It's very difficult to expand. At some point, you are released, I guess, from the radius point. But the question is, how far out do you have to go before you are released from this geometric obligation? It's a difficult question, and it's difficult, therefore, to actually expand these things because any architect who's ever produced a paving pattern, just go over to the shaft in front of the Student Center and look at the cuts that had to be made in order to create that round pavement. They're nasty cuts, cutting those pavers, because the pavers are square and the space is round. It becomes very difficult to expand. You don't ever want to do that if you can avoid it. Along a little bit later, but about the same time, there's a French theorist who is essentially a defense engineer named Vauban, V-A-U-B-A-N. Vauban, in most histories of cities, occupies a much more prominent place than he will in this course because technology basically made all of this moot. But these complex kinds of forms that we see here of defense works were aimed actually at preventing breaches of the walls of the city in time of attack. And there we see how Vauban had actually, but he wrote books on this, treatises on fortifications and so forth. So Scamozzi is by no means alone in this. The most influential was a man named Filarete. And so that there are a series of these texts on the ideal city that are circulating among the courts of Europe and among the courts of the colonial French and Spanish colonial world, also among the British intellectuals, the lawyers, the architects, the sort of professional class of people who would be involved in drawing up a city, in designing something, etc., right? The sort of technical aspects of it. Now, keep in mind that there is another tradition that is a vernacular tradition that comes up out of the temples and the Inns of Court that we've already discussed. This is Lincoln's Inn. This is where William Penn is living, so he's very familiar with it. When he sketches out the plan, he actually writes it out and sends it to his surveyor general, a man named Captain Holme, Holme, who actually draws up the plan. As a result of the fire of 1666, there were, just to recap, a number of these ideal cities that were applied to the City of London, the 1 square mile of the City of London. None of them were ever implemented because London was a free port, and therefore the property rights within London, the crown, the church, etc., traditional forms of authority, had no control over the use of land or over the disposition of streets. Unlike Sixtus V, who could run a straight street, unlike the Commissioner of Transportation, who can run a straight street or a highway cutting through a neighborhood, unlike a school board who is charged with buying land and building schools, they couldn't do that in the City of London. And so it all came back pretty much the way that it was, at least in terms of the constitutional order. The buildings, of course, changed, but if you go down to, say, Lloyd's Bank today by Richard Rogers, and Cheapside is the name of the street pattern is almost identical to its medieval predecessor. Now, the plan that I think was the most influential in both Philadelphia and Savannah, and I think Morris has this wrong, was a plan drawn by Sir Richard Newcourt. The historian John Reps discounts this because Newcourt's plan was not actually published until the 18th century. So he rightly assumes that, well, if it wasn't published, how could it have been influential, right? How could the movie that you've not seen, that has not yet been made, be influential, right? Or how could the book that you have not yet read, like your textbook, how could that be influential, right? So it's a good question. On the other hand, Newcourt was part of this intellectual circle that Penn was a part of, and they had clubs, gentlemen's clubs, various kinds, in the West End of London. They had some of them actually became official, meaning that they actually held governmental status. I love these things. Some of them have names like the Society for the Improvement of General Knowledge. You know, I mean, what an ambition. I mean, I want to belong to that, you know. They went around mapping everything, and some of the maps that they produced in the 19th century of Calcutta, for example, of cities in Japan, for example, Athens, Greece, for example, are some of the best records, best maps that we have. England's a very small island, and these people were obsessed inwardly to some degree, and they mapped everything they could possibly map, and they ran out of things to map. And I think they were probably, having spent some time in England, looking for something good to eat, and so they began to reach out to the rest of the world and take much of it over for themselves. So I think Penn and Oglethorpe would have been familiar with this plan. regardless, there are two components of it that are very similar. Now, Philadelphia has a central square of 10 acres, which is intended to be for the public building, courthouse, and so forth, with 4 wards. The wards were quarters of the city, each one being a sort of like a city council district, right? And each one of those wards then had within it a public square which was intended to be for market functions and so forth. This one still exists intact. This is Rittenhouse Square. It's the only one that still exists intact. And if we look at Savannah, what you have here in each one of these blocks, the block itself is divided into 4 divisions with a central square, and then these are like cells that are then repeated. So you get 4 per cell, and I think that it must have given Oglethorpe, James Edward Oglethorpe, or whoever actually was the author of the plan for Savannah. Oglethorpe sort of gets the credit, but I'm not sure that he's the actual author. The truth is we don't know who the author was. We do know a lot about Philadelphia because we have, this is the letter to Captain Holm, so we know we know that William Penn was the author of the plan, combined with Holm, who actually drew this plan out. Now, if we sort of go up to 1762, about 100 years after its founding, and we're on the Delaware River, and now we've turned the plan from this way to this way, okay? So like that is the orientation. What we notice is that it didn't develop the way that Penn probably imagined. We know that he imagined it would develop. He was an intellectual. He was familiar with Aristotle's political theories. He believed that what men sought was some sort of participation in public life and what I would call a political identity. Doesn't mean Democrats and Republicans, but it means that you have some standing in life, all right, to participate in public affairs. Therefore, where would you think Penn, in his mind, the city would have developed from? The political centers, those squares which were reserved for public buildings. Where did it actually develop from? The economic center. And what was the economic center? The intersection of the land transportation route here, King Street, which will later be changed to Market Street, and water transportation. So it shifts from a political center to what in effect is a map of property values, because the most valuable land would have been right here, right, and along Market Street. Did the markets develop in these public squares? No. In fact, the street, there we see the building in the middle of the street because the market develops in the middle of the street. It's important to recognize here that the war with England that led to the autonomy and independence and the formation of the United States was fomented in the streets and the taverns, not in sort of public buildings, right? It was sort of a grassroots movement that occurred in the streets. And again, like New Orleans, the point that I was making there is that the street plays a very important role historically in the United States that is political in nature, actually. There we actually see, you don't even see Rittenhouse Square or City Hall Square. It's all being farmed. Yet the plan itself, the subdivision of the individual blocks, actually is retained because it's the only form of authority that existed, held as a kind of contract between the individual landowners and those who came to settle. So again, what we're looking at here by 1794, the United States is already in existence at this point. We actually have, again, a map, in effect, of property values. But more important, there we see the market building not developing in the square but in the middle of the street. And in fact, the squares do not even appear until the individual acts of building, the individual property owners on individual lots kind of build on them, and as a result, animate the boundaries of the public space. Right? Animates the boundaries of the public space. Now we're going to take this rectangle and we're going to turn it back around so that we can actually track this. This was done in a class at Bryn Mawr University, or college, outside of Philadelphia, and I have plagiarized them here. Please don't do that. But I did give them credit, I think, at some point. And this shows then the development of these streets and lots over time. So here we're looking at 1794. This is within that red rectangle. And we see that these are essentially farmhouses with plots of crops, right? But if you follow this through, what you see is that new streets are cut in generally along property lines, and that by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, this is in fact now beginning to be urbanized. And this is following a similar pattern to what we saw in the West End of London, where that patchwork quilt of land ownership in the liberties of Westminster, the streets are cut in along the property lines. This is something we can no longer do here because zoning doesn't allow it. Subdivision regulations do not allow it. I think that's a problem. But now the green that you see up here is actually part of City Hall Square, and City Hall will not be built until about 1881. Almost 200 years after Philadelphia is founded, they finally get around to building a city hall, a town hall. Here it is then in 1862 during the American Civil War, and then we see it here in 1885, and then the Sanborn Atlas of 1927, which more or less continues to today with the consolidation of some of these lots within the blocks to form larger buildings. This is Broad Street that we see here, running north to City Hall, dead ends into the 10-acre square of City Hall, parking deck, hotel, department store, bank, and this hotel I was hanging out of the window of the Hershey Hotel when I took that photograph. Remarkably constant in terms of the overall frame. And there we see it in 1855. Market Street is running right through the center of the City Hall Square. Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which we will encounter later down here, has yet to be built. Rittenhouse Square, the only one that remains intact, is down here. And this that we see, which is where the Museum of Fine Arts sits today, terminating this grand avenue, Benjamin Franklin Parkway, actually is the site of one of the first municipal water works built in the United States by a city that we see right along here on the Schuylkill River. So there's an aerial view of Philadelphia today with the original plan superimposed on it. And we see how that plan influenced the development of that city for 300 years. It's remarkable. It's almost intact. Rittenhouse Square, again, individual acts of building have animated this as a public space. I want to comment now on this. The Penn had imagined distances like single-family neighborhoods, distances between houses because he was terrified of fire. Now, in the absence of any direct control, where people were sort of left to their own devices, you could buy and sell property very easily. You owned it in what's called fee simple, as opposed to the British system where the landowner retains ownership of the ground and you lease it for 99 years. You build a building on it, and then after 99 years, it reverts back to the Duke of Bedford or whoever the landowner was. Here you own the land fee simple, and what that meant was that you could subdivide these, and you got these very narrow lots and very narrow buildings. The opposite also of what Penn had intended. The implication of this was that when modern fire codes came into existence, the problem in a thin building like that is you have no opportunity for vertical circulation. So you begin to see the same thing in New York. You begin to get the fire escapes that are actually added to the exterior of the building. Because there's not, each of the individual property owners don't have enough money to go in and sort of make major renovations into the guts of the building. This is about 1990 at 3rd Street and Market. This is Market running this way, 3rd Street going off in the distance. And if we look at it today, this area, the city has invested a good bit of money here in redoing the streets and the sidewalks and the sort of public parts of this. And we see that, in fact, many of these fire escapes are now gone, that the land uses, in fact, have changed. The land uses will change rapidly over time. This is 20 years ago. That's today. This is 20 years ago. Look how much it's changed. But again, the constitutional frame remains more or less constant. Now, Tidewater, Virginia is a complicated story. It's older than New England. Goes back to 1620. And I wanted to put this up so that you could read this because it's a kind of propaganda piece that is circulating in London in 1609, sort of trying to drum up support and business, in effect, for establishing a British colony in the land of Virginia. So I have sort of summarized this in the sidebar over on the left. It basically says, currently we have to go to Tunisia, to Italy, or to Spain to find certain goods. We are good sailors, which is true. We should be able to conquer the seas, which is true. We can go to the New World and we can bring back sugar, linseed for oil, oranges, lemons, almonds, rice, cotton, ginger, olives, indigo, which is a kind of dye, purple dye. It's very difficult to make. Blue is a very difficult pigment to make. Beaver hides, pearls, rich treasures, and we can have a route to China, Persia, India, and all the great places where all the good stuff is. It's a very old idea that goes back to the motives behind Ferdinand and Isabella, and they're still sort of imagining it 150 years later. And actually, same thing with the founding of Georgia. They'll imagine it in 1733 could grow silk. The indigenous population, I love this. The indigenous population will throw down their primitive ways and join us, and then they will want to buy manufactured goods from us. With what? Beads? I mean, you don't have any money, right? So it sort of gives, but I think it's a great insight into the mind of the colonial power. And then finally, this is my favorite, the Sibyl. Now, the Sibyl is a mythological Roman prophetess that appears in the Aeneid. And this actually says, the Sibyl prophesied that all nations shall come together and speak one language and be neighbors and so on and so forth. So, it's very high-minded. Everybody will come together and they'll all speak the same language. We'll all get along as brothers and sisters. And by the way, all those guys are going to be buying all our stuff, right? So what goes without saying here? What language are they going to be speaking? Esperanto? Arabic? English, right? I mean, that goes sort of without saying, left unsaid but implied. Again, insight into the mind of the colonizer. Now, the problem with Tidewater, Virginia, is that this is what it looked like. This is Spartina marsh, very valuable ecologically, but you can't grow anything in it or build anything on it. You can't get good footings. It's salt water. So it's going to be kind of hard to grow oranges and lemons in salt water, right? Well, this is where they landed. They picked probably about the worst place you could possibly imagine to try to establish a colony. I mean, just look at this photograph. This is the shoreline, right? Think that's changed recently? I mean, suppose a storm comes in, right? It'll just wash you away. The land is mostly Spartina marsh. You can't grow anything. This is scrub pine. with snakes and alligators. You dig 2 feet, you hit soup, water. It's not good for much of anything. The original colony was a corporate investment, a body of investors who came together and then basically hired people, all male, to come over here and to try to produce all these wonderful goods that they couldn't get, cotton and indigo and all this kind of stuff. Tobacco had not yet been, the addictive properties of nicotine had not yet become aware of this, and that's ultimately what would save Virginia economically. But the colony failed, and it failed miserably. Within a couple of years, the people who were hired to come over here basically mutinied. They said, well, we don't have any wives. So they said, okay, fine. Well, we'll send for your wives. So they sent for their wives. Wives came. Wives were there, probably went through one summer with, cockroaches that big and snakes, and said, Reginald, this is no good. I want to go back to England. And so, well, how are we supposed to get back? Swim? I mean, it's not possible. So eventually they just kind of left, and they went upriver. And they went upriver far enough so they hadn't seen anybody for a while, and they got out, and that's where they stayed. Now, the whole colony actually dissolved very quickly in a period of less than 10 years. And this is what this looks like. Here's Jamestown here, and then we see the James River that moves up to about right here, where you cross that fall line, where you cross into the metamorphic rock of the Piedmont, and that's where you had to get out of the boat. So these people who had nothing suddenly are out here with as much as 1,000 acres of land, right? Sparsely populated. A whole series of traditions develop around this, by the way, that have to do with things like the Roundup and so forth, because there was no way you could fence in that much land. They didn't even know how much land they had. They just knew that, Jennifer and Aaron were back downriver somewhere, right? And so you develop then a series of autonomous plantations without towns, and that is that the ships from the mother country would simply sail up the river, and you would then offload your product or load your product, and they would offload manufactured goods like brick and metal work and a coat or something that they could not manufacture on their own. The only thing they could do is sort of make grind corn and sort of make grits and feed themselves. The labor, there we see the big house, and then here on this plantation, these smaller houses. These were the houses that were originally for the labor. Who was the labor? Well, it was a group of people who were called indentured servants. And then after an act of the legislature, in the colonial legislature in 1704, when slavery was instituted, African slavery was instituted, the indentured servants gave way then to African slaves. If you look at the river, this map then, what you see are names. Cobham, for example, right? A very prominent lord in England. And that's his big house. That's his plantation that we see there. But if you go here, and what you'll discover is that back in the woods, in a clearing, is a courthouse, because there are no towns. You had to have a courthouse because you had to be able to record things like deeds, issue marriage licenses, bring someone up on some sort of charge if they had killed someone or something. You had to have courthouses. But the courts were not in session year-round. So you developed circuits. The judges were rare and few and far between, so the judges would ride around, and the court would only open up for the month of June, let's say, right? And then the court would be in session, and everybody would come in, and there's usually a tavern associated with it. Everybody would drink a lot of beer or something. And then the court would close, and they would go on to the next one. This is still embedded in the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court. We still call it a circuit, even though there is no longer, they're open year-round, right? This will actually come to play a big part of the settlement of the Midwest, as we'll see later. Now, these indentured servants, who were they? Well, they were mostly poor Welsh or some Scots, but people who basically didn't have any money, and so they would sell their children into bondage. Sell them. Lord Cobham, let's say, would say, okay, fine, I will accept Amy. She's an able-bodied 12-year-old, and I will pay her passage, I will feed her, I will clothe her, and one day a week I will give her religious instruction, provide for that. And in return, she will work for me for 20 years. After 20 years, she is free. So Amy comes, she's 12. 20 years later, she's 32. She's worked off her indenture. She wants to go back home. How is she going to do that? She can't. She doesn't have any money. She doesn't own anything other than the clothes on her back, maybe a toothbrush. So how is she going to get back home? She isn't. So what does she do? Well, she and her husband go upriver, right? And they go upriver until they have to get out of the boat. But all that land's already settled under a system called meets and bounds. And so they walk. And they walk until they don't see anybody, and then they sort of claim the territory. This would be in the Piedmont. So the whole sort of Appalachian culture is derived from these indentured servants in the 17th century prior to the advent of African slavery. Towns, they needed ports. So this is Yorktown, Virginia. That's it. We don't need to talk about it much more than that. Charleston, great town. I love it, but there's not a lot to say about that, right? It's between the Cooper and the Santee River, and then the battery, of course, which is to fortify it. Baltimore. You think I'm really exaggerating this, don't you? This is Baltimore, Maryland in 1732. Does anybody recognize where we are here? This is the Inner Harbor. Camden Yards is right here. That's where the Orioles play. Okay? Fells Point over here is just off the picture. That's Baltimore. All of it. There it is today. Right? So very few towns. There were some intended to be capitals. Annapolis, Maryland, for example, which clearly, I think, exhibits the sort of British confusion of trying to implement these Baroque ideas. You would never, architects, urban designers in here, I mean, just don't ever do something like that. I mean, how do you occupy that space with a building, you know? Crazy. Annapolis is a beautiful place today, still the capital of Maryland, the state of Maryland. Lovely spot, but a really bizarre plan. The courthouses this is one of them that's been restored by the local historical society on the Isle of Wight in Virginia. And then this, just to make this point, these isolated courthouses, this is actually Appomattox. You're looking here at General Lee's surrender to General Grant at the end of the American Civil War. And if you see it today, it's now, of course, a National Historic Site. The porch that you see here, of course, is this porch that you see here, although the columns have been replaced. And you'll notice there's nothing around it except this tavern where everybody would go and eat, stay, while the court was in session. So that's the center of town. There is no town, right? Well, the problem with this indentured servant business is that it proved to be very costly. And when the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the Caribbean got into the business of African slave trade, the English were not far behind. And so they began to engage primarily through the Dutch, who were great sort of seagoing traders. This is actually the origin of the ones we have records for, the origin homes of the indentured servants. There is a fantastic website, by the way, that's put together by Emory University and Harvard University, in which they have recorded the manifests of all the slave ships that entered the North American ports. That is an astonishing amount of material. And if you just Google it and look for it, I think you can find it. It's a treasure, an absolute treasure. This is actually then the origins of where the African origins of the slaves in Virginia, mostly from Biafra and the Gold Coast up here that we see sort of. Timbuktu would be just to the north of that. Angola, still a dialect which is spoken on the Georgia, South Carolina coast, often referred to as Gullah. That still has a lot of African sounds in the language. I mentioned tabby concrete the last lecture. There it is. It's concrete. What's it doing there? It's not in France. It's not in England. It's concrete. Then this Piedmont, again, there were indigenous settlements at Kolomoki Mounds and here just south of Macon and here in Augusta and around Columbia. Again, you can see the sort of fall line here as it comes down and around. And these were the inland ports that are now Columbus in order from left to right. Columbus, Georgia, Macon, Georgia, Augusta, Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, Richmond, Virginia. There you see just an aerial of where suddenly this navigable stream becomes not navigable. Looks like this. Can't sail through it. And you see the areas up in here. It's Albemarle County. This is actually the James River right here, and it sort of hits Richmond somewhere about right there. Had limited materials, and so this sort of Piedmont culture, Appalachian culture, began to develop a particular type of vernacular house, which was called a single pin house. Had a door, and then eventually you developed a double pin house, which is often referred to as a dog trot house because the dog could run all the way through the house, right? And the door shifts then to entering off of this breezeway through the center. These were typically away back. There are no roads, so sort of farm roads and other things kind of got built to connect these things up to the courthouse and to whatever landing you might have town. You can see the rugged nature of the topography here and this patchwork settlement pattern, which is of no discernible plan whatsoever. Today it looks sort of like this. Here you're fencing the yard, which is probably growing squash and beans, tomatoes, to keep the animals out. This little church, which I found, which is something I have always wondered about and don't know, it has two front doors. I've always found that very peculiar. Two front doors. I have no idea why. Possibly it's a double pin construction with a later roof addition. I have absolutely no idea. So in the absence of towns, you began to develop these kind of vernacular sort of social spaces that were completely made up, completely invented out of circumstance. So some of those are sort of dinner on the ground. You would have associated with crossroads churches, non-denominational crossroads churches. People who might have come from Ireland who were Roman Catholic suddenly find themselves in the Piedmont of South Carolina, and the only church is a Baptist church, and so they become Baptist. Poof, just like that. And then these kind of social events which are independent actually of towns. This comes into play in a big way, as we'll see with the settlement to the west. Now, we're just about out of time, so I only want to just go, I want to start on this just to give you something I think is quite funny. This is an English map of Georgia. Just to orient you, this is Savannah. It's a pretty accurate map, amazingly. I mean, you know, down here, New Orleans, this has been mapped. That's actually fairly, and they're aware. This is Louisiana, part of Louisiana. This is part of Florida. The French and the Spanish are here. English are up here. But Georgia goes all the way to Arkansas, right? Claims the territory all the way to the Mississippi River. And then they went and screwed it up and created Alabama and Mississippi. Kidding. And I like this one. This is a Spanish map which shows Florida going all the way to Arkansas and actually into Texas. And then if you look at Lake Erie, it's just sort of north of Chattanooga, right? You sort of go up over these mountains and poof, there's Lake Erie, right? Never mind that it's 1,000 miles away, right? It's just right there. And I like this, the vagueness of this and the sort of perception, again, like that little propaganda piece that I summarized earlier in the lecture. This tells you a lot about the mind of the colonial enterprise. And then there are certain traditions which are vernacular and certain traditions which are implanted like this, which never materialized, of a colony that would have been located where we are now. The Atlantic Ocean, by the way, would have been somewhere out here. This would have been maybe Alabama over here. That's how big this was. This was the colony of the Margravate of Azelia, and it's a good thing that it never developed because we would be at Azelia Tech right now. Okay. Are there any questions?